comment, the College Football Playoff Management Committee unanimously agreed upon an undisclosed amount of money for incoming ACC member SMU that will go to the conference. They were told like $6 million. Then all of a sudden it was only going to be $1 million. Well, they've ironed it out. It's going to be probably somewhere around $6 million, or between $1 and $6 million. Whatever it is, it's going to be more than $1 million. It'll be closer, most likely, to $6 million that they will get for being a part of the ACC now that the format has expanded. Chris Hummer, your thoughts about that? Did the college football people do it right?
I mean, if you're SMU, they did it right. I think it's probably the fairest thing to do, given that SMU walks in that situation, and SMU already being in a pretty big hole from a rights perspective was counting on that money to survive over the next couple of years. So to take that away from them, I think would have been pretty crippling.
You wrote an article that a lot of us have probably asked, and I've tried to ask a few athletes about NIL or whatever, and most of them, because they're worried about it being public or whatever, which would be anonymous, they're not quite so free with the information. But you wrote an article that everybody probably can't wait to read, and if they haven't, they should. How real is NIL? Anonymous recruits in college football's 2024 class dish on collectives, contracts, and more. What was perhaps, out of everything you learned, something that was surprising to you?
I think I don't know about surprise. I think it's surprising that at this point, collectives and people on the school side of things are starting to negotiate and essentially opt-out clauses for transfers. The transfer portal and NIL going at the same time have created unprecedented landscape in college football. And I think it's interesting that essentially contracts are void once a player enters the transfer portal in this era. Not shocking if you think about how contracts usually work in employment, but it's just a wrinkle of the process now that I think is a lot different. The actual numbers themselves weren't particularly shocking to me, but I hope people found them interesting.
How do players feel about the way that it is regulated, not regulated, the hoops that they have to jump through, or like Smoak said, even the stigma that comes with it, even though it's legal, it still feels to a lot of people like there's something wrong?
Well, I think, frankly, most 17 and 18-year-olds are happy to have an extra like $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 a year in their pocket. I mean, I think a lot of adults would be thrilled to have that much money a year in their pocket. So from that perspective, I think it's fine. I think depending on who you ask, athletes would like to be employees or they wouldn't. I don't think there's a consensus around that. I think a lot of the recruits I talked to were a little leery of eventually becoming employees of the university because you lose a little control in that way of doing things, essentially. The way it is right now, it's kind of like the Wild Wild West. I know that term is overused, but schools and athletes have a lot of freedom that they wouldn't have any more employment-based system. So I think the reactions from athletes on that perspective are a little more mixed.
So when you look at the NIL, let's go with some of the basic thoughts about it. There were thoughts that A&M had a $30 million NIL roster. There were thoughts that somebody was getting $13 million individually. Did those get blown out, the holes blown in those theories?
Well, the A&M rumor was always ridiculous. I think it originated with a poster online called Sliced Bread. Jimbo Fisher allowed him to rise to fame by mentioning that during National Signing Day. But that was always way off base. And I think you see that in some of the values here. There is one recruit in this article that is making around $1 million a year, but that is far less common than I think people believe. I would say you could probably count on maybe your fingers and toes the amount of $1 million players there are in college athletics, college football specifically. It is not a common thing. High-end quarterbacks can demand that much, and really, really special high school recruits can occasionally demand that much, but it is not a commonality. So in order to get a 2022 recruiting class of $30 million, you would have to pay essentially every player in that class $1 million, which just isn't happening. I would say it's significantly less than a third of that number. But I think what you are seeing based on this article is, like, in order to be competitive in the upper end of college football, your annual NIL value needs to probably be somewhere over $4 to $5 million a year. Because if you paid every recruit on your roster $75,000 a year, that'd be essentially $6.5 million a year. So you see what it kind of takes right now in college football to be competitive.
Chris, you mentioned, some players being apoplectic about being employees or unsure of that. With the unionization news about Dartmouth yesterday, do you think that will catch fire, or do you think it'll be more of a case-by-case basis, university to university, before there's a gigantic players union of 17 to 24-year-old guys, most of whom probably don't even understand completely how unions work?
Yeah, I think wide-scale collective bargaining will be difficult for college football, especially, I don't think any player will be eager to give up part of their essentially NIL value or whatever to pay union dues like you would in a normal union. But I think over the long term, and when I say long term in college football, I mean like 3 to 5 years, we will get to a place where there is a college athletes union, and we will see collective bargaining between whatever the operating structure is of college football. I get the feeling it'll probably be the college football playoff and players themselves. But in the short term, you might see a couple unions pop up in place to place, but I don't envision it being one of those things in 6 months where we look up and there are 133 unions in the FBS. I could be wrong, like I have been before with all this college football stuff, but that feels unlikely.
And it just so much has changed in a matter of really just like even COVID. It just the extra year, NIL transfer portal, all of it just came in at one time. Did anybody that you talked with or spoke with about NIL say that they did not ask for it?
Yeah, there's one or two players in the story I quoted that were not interested in NIL, period. It's not something they thought out. And some schools, frankly, still don't really make it part of their pitch, like some contending schools don't make it part of their pitch. It is not in the DNA of every program to be aggressive with NIL, and some schools, frankly, do it the right way, and by the right way in quotation marks, in terms of letting players seek out individual brand deals instead of essentially paying them a salary through a collective. So there are some players that it's not a priority for, but I would say for the majority of players, even if it's not your main priority, it is now part of the conversation in a way that even a year ago at this time, it wasn't really. The best players got some NIL deals, but now it's almost part of like essentially the presentation. Like you care about facilities, you care about academics, you care about contending, you care about the amount of dollars you can bring in, and it's up to every individual about what your priority is in that scale of factors.
In like Baylor, I know Mac Rhodes hates to hear this, but it seemed like that they were slow to pull the trigger and really jump into it. They were coming off the Sugar Bowl, the Big 12 championship, and it didn't seem like they took advantage of that. And now they have an NIL collective in GXG, and everybody's getting something. Well, the 85 whatever players. If you started late, how long does it normally take you to make up? Is it just a matter of how much money people will contribute to it?
Well, these collectives are interesting because essentially you're putting a tax on your fans to be competitive, which is frankly what it is. And some programs have richer fans than others. So it really just depends on how engaged you can make your donor class and NIL. And that's a risky, this is a different conversation, but it's a risky proposition because I think the 501c status of some of these schools is different than others. And in some cases, these funds will not be forgiven on your taxes. They won't be a write-off. And it's much harder in some cases to get donors to donate to NIL collectives than it would be to facilities where you could just write off as a donation to a university. So I think it's really case by case in terms of how active and how motivated your donor base is. I think we saw Ohio State kick things into a gear they haven't been before this offseason, for example. And I think seeing your rival win a national championship can do that.
Chris Hummer with us, 247 Sports. Did anybody say that if you don't produce, and I read the article, I'm just asking you for the audience too, so if they get an NIL, whatever the money might be, have any of them, or did they hear of anybody that actually lost money based on the guarantee because they did not play enough or play well?
Yeah, I had a couple of recruits in the story say that if they don't play well, their contract can go down potentially when they negotiate the next time around. And then some of these players have multi-year contracts, and some of them have year-by-year contracts that can be renegotiated based on a number of factors. So yeah, absolutely. I think that would be a wake-up call for some players as well, that you don't perform up to expectations and you might not get to keep the deal you had. And I can think of several players in the transfer portal this offseason who ended up leaving their programs because their money that they had the previous season wasn't on the table for them again, because of a number of factors. So it can lead to upset feelings, and it can lead to changes on a roster pretty quickly if a player isn't as happy with his deal as he was before.
Chris, great stuff. Thank you very much. I'll put your link to the story up in our chat room and also attach it to Twitter here in just a moment. Good stuff. That's a